China keeps making the same three diplomatic mistakes when dealing with India. From the 1962 India-China War to the 2020 Galwan Valley clashes, China's diplomatic errors and inability to understand India's foreign policy objectives over 7 decades have played a part in creating one of Asia's greatest rivalries. In a recent paper written for the think tank Carnegie India, veteran diplomat Vijay Gokhale looks into the evolution of China's India policy. In it, he identifies some key mistakes China makes when it approaches negotiations with India. Mistake 1. Misjudging India. China has repeatedly misjudged India's foreign policy goals since diplomatic relations were established in 1949. To begin with, China's leaders believe that India isn't an independent power and doesn't deserve to be treated as an equal. In the view of many of China's past leaders, India is seen as a nation dependent on other major powers like the United States. Gokhale points out that this problem goes all the way back to the 1950s. For example, India was among the first nations to formally recognize the communist government in China. It was also a leader of the non-aligned movement, which refused to take sides in the Cold War between America and the Soviet Union. Despite this, China's communist leaders like Mao Zedong were unconvinced about India's independence on the world stage. For Mao, everybody had to lean either to the side of imperialism or to the side of socialism. Sitting on the fence will not do, nor is there a third road. In Chinese eyes, India was not part of the socialist bloc and was therefore a part of the imperialist bloc, says Ambassador Gokhale. China viewed India, and particularly India's first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, as a collaborator of imperialism and an American running dog. Mao Zedong, who ruled China from 1949 to 1976, said that India did not win independence. If it did not attach itself to Britain, it attached itself to the Soviet Union. Despite India's track record of independent decision-making, China believes India to be a lackey of foreign powers. This misjudgment has haunted every Chinese leader from Mao to Xi Jinping. Mistake 2. Misread India's actions. Ambassador Gokhale argues that by refusing to acknowledge Delhi's independence in foreign affairs, Beijing routinely misreads India's actions. For example, China was suspicious about Indian concerns over Beijing's takeover of Tibet in 1959. Beijing also didn't like the fact that India was pushing for a resolution to the boundary dispute between the two countries in the 1950s. While New Delhi believed the disputed boundary to be a matter of sovereignty, China concluded that India was using these problems to get support from backers like the United States and the Soviet Union. Mao Zedong said at the time that our fight with India is a complicated international question. It is not only that India is a problem. Both the US and the USSR and others are supporting India. They think they can teach us a lesson by dragging us into the arena at a time when we are facing difficulty. But we shall not succumb to their scheme. Mistake 3. Overreaction. Having misjudged and misread India, China then concluded that New Delhi needed to be humbled and pushed back into neutrality. For example, China's frustration with its inability to secure a diplomatic settlement to the India-China boundary crisis pushed its leaders like Mao Zedong to overreact and use aggression in the belief that it would discipline India. This thinking launched a series of events that ultimately led to the 1962 India-China War. The result of these three mistakes is the failure of Chinese policy towards India. While China hopes to push India towards neutrality and end aggression towards Beijing, it only ultimately buys Indian resistance and ill will. For example, China's desire to push India into neutrality through the 1962 war only led India to reinvest in its military, buy arms from the West, and institute a 25-year freeze in relations with China. In short, China's tendency to misjudge, misread, and overreact has led to the failure of its India policy. This also goes some way towards explaining China's foreign policy towards India today. For example, let's take a look at the Galwan Valley clashes. Step 1. Misjudge. Despite India's growing economy, substantial military power, and stated desire for strategic autonomy in the international sphere, China continued to believe that India's close relationship with the United States meant that its capacity for independent decision-making had been compromised. Step 2. Misread. Since the United States had followed an increasingly hostile policy to China in recent years, India's growing relationship with America was worrying to China. As such, growing India-US ties and India's ability to construct key border infrastructure was a threat to China. Step 3. Overreact. According to Ambassador Gokhale, Chinese scholars believe that China uses coercion on the LAC to warn India while keeping the possibility of geopolitical backlash low. The Chinese assessment is that India's cooperation with the United States has not yet reached a level that might compel Washington to intervene in support of Delhi, and that in these circumstances, China's relative strength along the LAC is adequate to unsettle India without provoking a backlash, he says, citing Chinese scholars. This has led to a decade of increased activity and tensions on the Sino-Indian border. It also led to the clashes in Galwan Valley in June 2020 that claimed the lives of 20 Indian soldiers. Step 4. Failure. Just like in 1962, China's orchestration of the Galwan Valley clashes has led to a significant hardening of India's position on Beijing. China is widely regarded as a threat in India, which has increased its support for the Quad and has also shown an increased risk tolerance, for example through the Yudh Abhyas exercises near the LAC with America. China's belief that force will solve its problems with India has once again proved fundamentally flawed. India's rivalry with China will be one of the defining diplomatic challenges in the coming decades. Understanding how Beijing thinks and how it sees India is vital for New Delhi to rise to the China challenge.